So March 11th was the eighth anniversary of the Fukushima incident in 2011. A big earthquake and tsunami hit the eastern shore of Japan and subsequently also damaged a couple of nuclear reactors. And at the time, of course, this was big news and a big catastrophe, but there was also a very biased view on sort of the reactor catastrophe as compared to the tsunami itself, which killed something like 16 to 18,000 people in Japan. And so even 8 years after that, where you would think that the facts have been straightened out, there are still some myths circulating, both in the media and in the blogosphere and social media and so on. And I just want to clarify two things that I saw that I found particularly bad, like fake facts on this issue. And one is comes from Germany. So there's an institution called the Landeszentrale für politische Bildung Baden-Württemberg, and Baden-Württemberg is a southern German state, and it's a state agency for public education. And they tweeted on the anniversary of Fukushima thousands of 1,000 victims of the nuclear catastrophe in Fukushima. And this is, of course, obviously wrong, because thousands of victims were from the tsunami, and nobody died from the radiation of the damaged nuclear power plants, even though it was a significant threat at the time. And so they sort of paddled back after being criticized, but apparently only with one paddle. So they drove circles in their little boat. So, and now they have referenced a website dossier from the time that they reported on it, and then claiming they essentially had many factual errors in there, but the most egregious thing that they did was they put Fukushima in the same category as Chernobyl. So technically, on the scale of radiation released, it's sort of in the same category, but the problem is that the highest category of nuclear accidents sort of is open-ended, and it puts together all kinds of accidents. So Chernobyl, of course, caused a couple of immediate deaths and probably many deaths in the aftermath, and Fukushima did not. So interestingly, in Baden-Württemberg, in the southern German state, probably as a result of the Fukushima incident, a Green Party prime minister was elected, who is still in office. So maybe that's a hint where the ideological direction of this is going. Another example of the myth around Fukushima is a Time magazine article from 2018 titled "Japan Acknowledges First Radiation-Linked Deaths from the Fukushima Nuclear Disaster." So they don't attribute thousands of deaths to this incident, but at the time, like in 2018, there was a Japanese worker who, at the time of the cleanup work like shortly after the incident, received a significant dose of radiation of 195 millisievert. And, just to put this in proportion, it seems somewhat clear that over 100 millisievert, your risk of getting a long-term health problem in form of cancer is increased. So below 100 millisievert, you can't really attribute anything to that. And above that, there's some statistical significance to health impacts there if exposed to a large population. But the problem here is that this was based on a Japanese broadcasting service report that this worker was actually, so the government didn't acknowledge that the radiation actually caused this cancer. They just made his family eligible for compensation payments. So it's a formal sort of acknowledgement, hey, this guy worked for us and he now got cancer, and we are going to compensate his family for this. And this is not at all a sort of proof that this cancer was caused by the radiation exposure. And it's also statistically very unlikely that this particular cancer, this lung cancer, was caused by this radiation. one is it's atypical for the radiation exposure to get lung cancer, and two is from experience in other exposure sort of natural experiments like the nuclear bomb drops and other accidents, we know that these cancers take a long time to develop, often decades, and this is a very short time period for this to develop. So it seems very unlikely, both statistically and from what we know how this develops, that this is actually a case of someone dying from the radiation. So for all we know, at this point, there's probably zero dead people from the Fukushima radiation exposure.
Well, except for the forced evacuations.
Yeah, so that's another good point. So both the evacuation measures in place at the time and also the cleanup work have seen some deaths. So the cleanup work, of course, thousands of workers with heavy machinery involved, that causes some deaths, and also the rushed evacuation of vulnerable population in hospitals and so on. That was also very stressful and actually killed some people. So the current debate among experts is, okay, is this kind of extreme measure of evacuating people, when we see low doses of radiation in the area, is this actually warranted? Is this the best course of action?
One thing I've been thinking about, and this has come up on Power Hours a long time ago, is just how we should negatively evaluate people who create unwarranted fear. And you're certainly seeing this with the climate issue, where you have all these stories of people who are seeking therapy and who are feeling terrible about climate and who fear apocalypse in the future. And this is very real damage, and this is damage to people's enjoyment of life. And certainly in a concentrated sense, you see this with nuclear, where if there's any kind of accident, people are being taught that, oh yeah, you're going to get cancer and this is a big threat to your life, and so you should run. And then that can actually just get people killed if you're trying to move elderly populations quickly, and that there are dangers there. But then just more broadly, you're making people's lives miserable. And yet there's not much of a social cost to pay for fear mongering, even though that is a dramatic harm to people's enjoyment of life. And with the climate thing, it's crazy. And I've heard even smart psychologists talking about this, but interestingly, a lot of the, certain psychologists, like cognitive psychologists or cognitive behavioral therapists, will talk about things like distortions, and they'll say, well, you're engaging in distorted thinking when they're talking to somebody just about somebody's normal thinking. And yet with climate catastrophe, I hear the same people saying, yeah, it's totally reasonable what you're thinking about climate catastrophe. I don't know what to tell you. And it's just like, no, this is exactly the kind of thing where your mind is just totally going nuts, exaggerating this one area, and then you're ignoring all these things that you actually should be more afraid of, like blackouts. Don, do you have one more thing to say, Steffen?
Sorry, on that note, so I've seen people discussing that it's highly plausible in the case of Chernobyl that the anxiety issues caused by the public narrative about the negative impacts of the radiation is actually more harmful to human health in the area than the radiation.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all.